Hello and welcome to this YouTube Live. My name is Anuska Taylor. So great to have you here, whether you are watching live or whether you are watching the replay. So today we are talking about your amazing larynx, and maybe you don't even know what the larynx is, but today I'm going to be sharing more about this and how it's really responsible for bringing sound to life. So as a speaker, it's essential to really understand more about your larynx and also how you can help it do its job more effectively and more efficiently. So I'm going to sort of get straight into it because I think what I would like to do today is show you a few slides of things just so that you have more of a sort of visual image of what we're talking about, because the thing with working on the voice and talking about the voice is it's very abstract. We can't actually see it. When we can see it moving to some extent, but so much of it, we have no idea of what's really going on. Of course, if you play the piano or the guitar, you can see exactly what's going on. So let me share, first of all, before we get into it, just an image of your voice. And just so to put this in some kind of context of what we're talking about today. So maybe you're not aware of this, but there are actually three essential systems required or subsystems required for voice production. And specifically here today, we're talking about speech. And I talk a lot about all of these. And in other videos, I've talked about the first one, respiration, your breath, absolutely essential for powering your voice. You literally don't have a voice without breath. We're not talking about that today. The second one is what we're going to be talking about today, which is phonation, essentially the creation of the sound waves. And obviously, you need sound waves. There would be no voice without sound waves. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Don't worry, it's not going to be too technical, but there will be some sort of biology and anatomy just to help you understand it a little bit more. And also we're going to be talking, we're not going to be talking about this. This is the third system, which is resonation. And again, I do talk about that quite a lot as well. I did a video recently on resonance in the voice. So just so you have this idea, there are three subsystems: respiration, phonation, resonation. They all need to be working together for your voice to really be maximized. This is regardless of accent, because our voices all function the same. So today we're going to be talking about phonation and specifically your larynx, which is the key to this. So let me just take that slide off. Ta-da! Now, let me get back to the larynx. So I've actually got another image of the larynx, more in depth. But first of all, it's important to say we really couldn't speak or make any sound without our larynx. And you might also know the larynx as your voice box. And lots of people rely on their voice, but really have no idea about this incredible instrument, or as I like to say, your amazing larynx. So even though we all have one, even though we all need one. So let me just show you a little image quickly here. And I thought this image was quite useful because it's put it in situ. And so you can see there that it's really part of the respiration system. And a couple of interesting things before we get into how it relates to speech is its primary role is actually as a valve to protect the lower airway, to protect food, water, debris, whatever, dust getting into the lungs. And so you probably experienced it before. If you get anything anywhere close to it, if you accidentally, bit of food or water goes down the wrong tube, as I like to say, you will immediately cough. So there's this reflexive action. But another interesting function of the larynx, which again I've talked about before as it pertains to weightlifting, is the Valsalva maneuver. And so within your larynx are housed the vocal folds or the vocal cords. And as I say, they act like a valve to sort of protect the lungs. But one of their other functions is actually to create this sort of internal pressure. So it actually gives you extra strength and power to lift weights, to lift heavy objects, Things like childbirth, you have that sort of internal pressure, that internal strength to push a baby out, going to the toilet as well. So we all actually use the Valsalva maneuver. We might not realize it, and our larynx is central to that. So two really important functions before we even get to speech, to singing, to sound creation. And as I mentioned, the vocal folds are housed in the larynx. So later on in this video, I am going to be just taking you through a little get to know you larynx step-by-step guide. But for the moment, we'll leave it there just so you can actually sort of see roughly what we're talking about with the larynx. So it sits right at the top of your airway or your trachea. And if you put your fingers on your throat, I'm just going to take this image away. If you put your fingers on your throat, you'll actually feel it bobbing up and down. For men, it's usually more obvious. There's more of a protrusion because the larynx is bigger, so often referred to as the Adam's apple. And so just so you have a sort of an awareness of where we're talking about here. And there's actually 18 muscles in and around the larynx. I was going to say the larynx that rapidly contract and release in a very coordinated way to create your speaking voice. And this is always mind-blowing to me because I'm always like, how does anyone actually ever speak or do anything? Because there's so much going on that we have no conscious control over, which brings me to my first point before we get into this in more depth, that the muscles are controlled very unconsciously. You don't think about how you speak, otherwise you'd probably never utter a word again. And so anyone that follows my work will know that I talk a lot about how the mind drives the voice. Free the mind to free the voice, essentially. And this is why, because your mind is literally controlling the muscles of your voice. And because you don't think about it, it's very much habitual patterns. It's very much conditioning around how you've been taught to use your voice, which is why when we want to make any real change with our voice, we have to go within first before we go without. So very, very important. I'm not going to talk so much about that today, but just to kind of give you some idea of why I always go on about this if you've watched any of my other videos. So as I mentioned, within the larynx are housed the vocal folds or the vocal cords, which are essential for phonation. Phonation is the sort of vibration of the vocal folds to create sound waves. And from a speech perspective, and this is what we're going to really get to today, it's the quality of how those vocal folds vibrate that's going to determine the quality of your voice. Now, yes, the resonance and the resonance chambers, the throat, the mouth, the nose can have a profound impact on the tone of your voice, but you basically can only get out what you put in, but a more enhanced or modified or amplified version. Meaning if you put in a strained, rough quality voice, as in the vocal folds are creating a strained or rough quality, there's only so much that these resonating chambers can do. It can't take a strained voice into a smooth voice, for example. So a lot of this is starting at this vocal fold level, which is not something that a lot of people actually talk about for speakers. A lot of the work tends to be on the surface, which is why I really like to go a little bit deeper, because this is really where you want to start bringing more focus. And then when you bring, and then when you work on the resonance aspect of it, then that's when your voice really can become very, very powerful, very expressive, and very clear and very free. So let's talk about the vocal folds. And again, this may not be something that you've ever thought about, heard about. You might know them as vocal cords. And I'm going to use my hands to kind of demonstrate the vocal folds. Just before we get into this, I just want to say I'm going to be referring to them as vocal folds. And I'll tell you later when we get into this why vocal cord isn't actually a very helpful term. Actually, in science now, they really talk about them as vocal folds. but we will get into why it's not a very helpful term in a minute. But so I'm going to be referring to them as the vocal folds. And essentially they are in a V shape. So here's your larynx. Obviously they're not this size, but let's just imagine for a moment that they are. You're going to have to use a little bit of imagination. These are your vocal folds. They're in a sort of V shape. And we've got the length of the vocal fold and we've got the depth of the vocal fold. And then they come together to vibrate. To put it in some kind of perspective, the average size of your vocal folds for a sort of adult is between 1.75 and 2.5 centimeters. So they are absolutely tiny. So obviously my hands are ginormous in comparison, but just to give you that perspective. So we're talking about something very, very small. And there's many layers to your vocal folds. And within the middle of them is a muscle, the vocalis muscle. So it is a muscle essentially that we're dealing with. So what happens then for speech? Just very, very simply. And again, this is a very sort of complex process, but I'm going to try and give you what I think is really important. And obviously we could be here all day talking about this otherwise. So when you decide to speak, and this will happen at lightning speed, of course, a message is sent to your brain to bring these vocal folds together. So remembering that they are in their resting position open so that you can breathe easily. So you think, okay, I want to speak to that person. The vocal folds are brought together to the midline. And then air pressure starts to build up underneath them from the lungs. And what will happen is when there's enough air pressure underneath, it will start to blow apart the bottom, and then they will start to come apart until they fully come apart at the top. And then that air is released, and then it sucks them back together. And this is what we end up with, this wave-like motion. And this is what is happening constantly when you're speaking. It is so fast, you cannot see it with the naked eye. It's roughly about 200 times per second, so way too fast to see with the naked eye, but you can see it under a video stroboscopy. So if you are interested, go on YouTube and Google video stroboscopy of vocal folds and you'll see it. But essentially what we see on these videos is this wave-like motion. It's absolutely incredible. And this is the start of your voice coming to life. So it's moving in this wave-like motion. Obviously, you've got to use a little bit of imagination with my hands at the moment, pretending to be vocal folds. So from a speaking perspective then, which is what this is all about, so what effect can you have at that level on your voice? So you're probably thinking, oh, that's really nice. They're vibrating. Great. I don't really need to worry about that, surely. Well, actually, you do if you want to really have any effect on the quality of your voice. So as I mentioned, they come together in the midline, they're blown apart, they come apart, and they snap back together. Now, within that cycle, we have what we call open and closed phases. So they're together at one point and then they're open at another point. The longer the vocal folds are open, the breathier the voice, the lighter the voice, the weaker the voice. The longer they are together, the louder, the more powerful, the fuller the voice. So a lot of the time when I'm working with clients, if I'm trying to rebalance the voice, if there's a lot of breathiness and lots of air, I'll be giving them exercises to actually help them bring their vocal folds together. I don't necessarily tell them this, but that's what I'm doing, and vice versa. If I'm hearing a lot of, there's a lot of sort of loudness in the voice and we want to find more dynamics and find perhaps a little bit of a more quieter or softer tone, then we will do the opposite. So, but just to give you that idea, so first of all, just how open or closed they are is going to determine that aspect of quality. Now, I said earlier about vocal cord is not actually a very useful term, even though it's in the popular culture. And the reason being, from my perspective, is if you think about a cord, it's sort of long and thin, and you might think of like the vocal cord as a bit like a guitar string or a violin string. But actually, the vocal folds have depth to them, which is why I'm using my hands like this, because we've got the depth of the vocal fold as well as the length of the vocal fold. And the depth is very, very important for the power in your voice. So the more of your vocal fold that vibrates, the more powerful your voice, the richer your voice, the fuller your voice. The less of it that vibrates, the thinner your voice, the lighter your voice, the weaker your voice. So one of the other aspects of voice training is, if we're trying to aim for more power, more strength, more volume in the voice, we're going to be working on getting more of that complete vibration of the vocal fold versus just this sort of half the vocal fold is vibrating. And that's when you get that thin voice. Now think about, I mean, I've spent a lot of time, not so much, I mean, I don't really work with kids anymore, but I used to work with a lot of young girls, sort of, 12, 10, 11, 12 years old, in terms of singing. And it's very typical at that age for females to have a very light, sort of weak voice, because the muscles are still developing, because the voice is still developing strength. So that's very common at that age. But as an adult, the potential is there to get more power in your voice if you learn how to get a fuller, more complete vibration of your vocal folds. So we talked about the depth and also the length. So it's not just, they're not just deep, but they're long as well. And they can be stretched and they can be shortened. They are this like miracle. I just find them amazing, actually. Considering the size of them as well, it's mind-blowing. So the shorter the vocal fold, the lower our pitch. The longer our vocal fold, the higher our pitch. Now, as a speaker, you might obviously you don't necessarily want to be singing opera, but you want to be able to vary your pitch, which is why I always say to people, warming up your voice is really important, even as a speaker, because then you're getting this flexibility through the vocal folds. They get a good stretch. And so then when you do want to play around with variation of pitch, you might want to speak a little bit higher, a little bit lower. The vocal folds have that flexibility and the agility to stretch for higher pitches and to shorten for lower pitches. All of this does take a lot of flexibility, coordination, and you do need to kind of keep the voice trained, warmed up, healthy and supple for it to be able to do this smoothly. So that's that. So we've talked about the open and closing. We've talked about the depth. We've talked about the length. In terms of then the quality of the vibration, so it's not just how much of my vocal fold is vibrating, but what's the quality of that vibration? And when it's a regular, complete vibration, you're going to get a smooth quality to your voice. When it's irregular and sort of incomplete, that's when you might start to notice roughness or raspiness in the voice. And again, we can do things to support this sort of full closure. And then finally, in terms of what's going on at the vocal fold level, we can talk about onset. Now, this is really how you start a note, which is going to sound a bit weird because you're like, yeah, but I'm speaking, I'm not singing. But you still speak on a note, whether you're aware of it or not. So if I was to get a piano, I'd be able to find what note or notes you speak on primarily. I mean, the main difference is when we speak, we tend to speak in a very, very narrow range. And for a lot of speakers, moving outside that range is very scary. You know, I want to get a bit more elevation, a bit more animation in my voice. I've got to get outside my pitch comfort zone with my voice. But how we start those notes, how we start those words is very, very important. And the vocal folds have a big part to play in this. So if we think about onset, we have sort of three main types of onset that we can talk about. So we have hard, breathy, and balanced. And we're always aiming for balance in the voice, the balance of air and muscle. So with hard onset, it would be, if I was saying something like good morning, if there was a hard onset in my voice, it would be good morning. It would be very sort of slammed and very harsh on the voice. If I was to go the other way and it was very breathy, it would be good morning, everyone. I'm exaggerating obviously here. And then the balance is somewhere, we've got that balance of air and muscle. Good morning. So we're not slamming into the vocal folds, but they are also not just coming apart and there's just lots of air and it's very breathy. These are the two extremes. So that's what we can affect at the vocal fold level. We have control at this level over the sort of volume we can get in the voice, our ease or not to access different pitches in the voice. So how high or low we speak, how much power we get in the voice, and our overall voice quality. Is it smooth? Is it rough? Is it raspy? Is it croaky? Like, what's the quality? Because it's too late. The horse has already bolted if you wait and try and think, oh, well, I'll just use the mic to deal with that. It's really got to happen at this level. So the free voice, the voice that we're really aiming for, our true voice, has variety, very, very important, but it's not excessively breathy, rough, weak, or strained. There's a balance, there's a fullness of that sort of vocal fold vibration without straining, without squeezing, and without it coming apart. So everything is kind of in balance. And then, you know, occasionally, depending on what we're doing, we might choose to go into a particular character or a particular space with our voice. Maybe we're reading a story to our children. Maybe we're an actor and we're reading and we're playing a character. Then it becomes a choice versus I can only use my voice with a lot of breath or a lot of strain or a lot of weakness or a lot of roughness in my voice. That's always pointing to something else that's not really functioning very well. So we've talked about the vocal folds. Hopefully I haven't lost you too much because it can be very complicated, and I'm trying to keep this as simple as I possibly can. So what does the larynx then need to move freely and effortlessly? Because ultimately the larynx is housing the vocal folds. So if this is the larynx, again, you've got to really use your imagination. The vocal folds live in the larynx. So if there's a lot of constriction and tension and the larynx is very tight, that is going to impact what the vocal folds are able to do or not do. So what hinders the larynx moving freely? This is really important. And a key to understanding this is the hyoid bone. Now, in that little image I showed you before, in fact, let me try and get this back up again. Give me 1 second. You'll see the hyoid bone there at the top. And the hyoid bone is very, very important to understanding your voice because the larynx is suspended from the hyoid bone. So it's absolutely critical for the voice. But what's really important is it has connections to your neck, your jaw, your tongue, your throat, your sternum, and your shoulders. This little bone is just this like super connector. It has a direct connection to the tongue, but it has these other connections too. Meaning, if there's a lot of constriction or excessive tension through your neck, your jaw, your tongue, your throat, your sternum, your shoulders, it's going to impact your voice on some level. And I think for a lot of us, particularly as speakers, I include myself in this too, we're sitting down a lot all day. We're often hunched over devices, computers, mobiles. And so we're not really giving the larynx the best opportunity to function, to move, have that freedom. And that is going to impact what those poor little vocal folds can actually do. So I'm just going to take this away now, but just so you could sort of see that. So let's talk about, first of all, head-neck alignment. Very important because the larynx lives in the neck. And you can do this yourself right now. I mean, you don't have to take my word for any of this. You can try this yourself. So if you poke your chin up, or you poke your chin down, or you move your chin forward, so you might be someone, I find I have a propensity to do this on a laptop. I'll end up like this. But obviously, a lot of us have our chins down when we're on like mobiles and stuff. You see that all the time on the train and the tube. So keeping the chin sort of parallel to the ground allows the larynx to move freely. And what we're aiming for with the larynx is for it to kind of be able to sort of bob up and down like sort of a bobbing apple. So it's not pushed down, it's not pushed up, it just has that freedom of movement. So you can play around with this now, like say something like, say, my name's whatever your name is, and then move your chin up, move your chin down, poke your chin forward, and say it on each of those with your chin in those different positions, and just notice what happens to your voice. And then bring your chin back to parallel to the ground, head on top of the shoulders, and notice the difference. Even if you don't do anything else, notice the difference. But obviously, as part of that is also the upper body. So are your shoulders hunched forward? Is your chest collapse? It's all of it. It's all got to be kind of open, whether you're sitting or whether you're standing. I mean, I say often that the voice is a full body instrument, and it really is a full body instrument. But if we were to narrow it down, it's probably like a, you know, I mean, it's a full body. It is still a full body instrument, but bring particular attention to your upper body. What's going on at your chest, your shoulders, the neck, your jaw, because there's probably enough to focus on with that. Speaking of jaw, the next one is jaw. I've done lots of videos on the jaw and its impact on the voice, but just to play around with this in your own voice, notice what happens to your voice when you jut your chin, your jaw forward, like that. And a lot of us do all this weird stuff and we don't even know that we're doing it. So we're immediately sort of impeding the voice without even realizing that we're doing it. So when we jut the chin forward, we're pushing the larynx up, whether we're aware of this or not. If we open our jaw really wide, I mean, I don't see that so much in my work. People, if anything, tend to go the other way and have their jaw very clenched shut. But then the larynx can't move if the jaw is open really wide. But then again, if the jaw is clenched shut as well, we're creating a lot of tension. I mean, you feel it immediately around the neck and therefore the larynx. So what you're aiming for with the jaw is the jaw just needs to be soft and dropped. It doesn't actually need to do anything. It wants to do things, or it doesn't want to do things. It tends to kind of get overly involved, or just very, very tense and tight and doesn't do anything. But actually what we want is it for it to be softly dropped, about 1 to 2 centimeters when we're speaking, and just let the tongue and the lips do the articulation. Because what I often see with people is the jaw wants to get involved in speech. And so they'll find that the jaw is actually kind of almost like tied up with, say, the movement of the tongue. You know, for example, I might ask people to isolate their tongue in a particular exercise, and they can only do it if the jaw is involved as well. So we really just want the jaw out of the way, softly dropped, and let the tongue and the lips do the work for articulation. But obviously you've got to have your jaw open for the sound to come out. So we don't want to draw like this either. So yeah, just look in a mirror and notice what your jaw does or doesn't do when you speak. And then see if you can just drop your jaw sort of 1 to 2 fingers depth, maybe go for 1 to start with, and just see if you can kind of keep it there as a general rule and speak, and notice what a difference it makes to your voice actually coming out. Another point to make about the jaw, the back of the neck will also hinder the jaw if it's tight as well. So what you're probably realizing is everything is connected. It's you can't really isolate anything because there's a domino effect to other things. So next one is tongue. Again, I've done lots of videos on the tongue. It sounds a bit weird to say that, but it's true. As I spoke about earlier, hyoid bone with the larynx, which the larynx is suspended from, has a direct connection to our tongue, meaning the voice and the tongue are inextricably linked. So if the back of the tongue is tight or tense, it will immediately impact the voice or the larynx. And you may not realize that your tongue is tense actually, because for a lot of people, the root of the tongue, the back of the tongue is tight, but because they don't really use their tongue a lot, the tongue is quite lazy in speech anyway. It doesn't even really matter in that sense, so they don't really notice it. So it's only when we start really working on more intentional articulation that they realize, oh, actually, my tongue's not used to really doing that much. So just start to pay attention to your tongue, how much does it actually move when I speak? Or is it my jaw doing all the work and maybe my lips occasionally move, but my tongue is fairly lazy in my mouth? We want it to be coming forward. We want it to be moving. And if the back of the tongue is really tight, it's not going to be able to move freely forward. It's going to be always being pulled back into the back of the throat. So that tip of the tongue, we want it to be moving forward as we are articulating and enunciating. Soft palate as well. Tension in the tongue will tighten the soft palate and vice versa. Soft palate, critical for nasality in the voice or reducing nasality in the voice. So if you perceive a lot of nasality in your voice, chances are your soft palate is not particularly agile, probably a little bit stiff, probably a little bit lazy. And so again, that's going to impact the tongue as well. So just throwing a few bits out here. But if this resonates with you at all, and I will post the links below, check out my videos specifically on the jaw and the tongue, because I go into a lot more depth with them there. I'm not going to go into the depth here because this video is meant to be about the larynx more specifically. And of course, that's become a little bit, it's hard to isolate things when we're talking about the voice because it's all connected. So now we've looked at the larynx itself. Let's look now, going back to the vocal folds, what they need for optimal use. And as I said before, there's so many ways they can impact the voice. And what we're aiming for is for a full, firm closure when they vibrate. So there's enough air, but there's not too much air. There's enough closure, but there's not too much closure that you're squeezing and straining the voice. So we want a balance, essentially, is what we're aiming for. But these are two of the common areas I see. Most people fall into one or two, either of these categories. Maybe not at the extreme, but in some way they fall into these categories. So let's look at the two sides of the fence, so to speak. So first of all, too much air pressure. So I'm just going to remind you again how the voice sort of very basically functions. When we begin to think about speaking, the vocal folds come together, air builds up underneath, and then that air pressure, when it gets to a certain point, actually the bottom of the vocal folds then start to come apart. They come fully apart, the air comes up, and then they slap back together again. And this is the cycle. And this happens at lightning speed. So I'm not going to be demonstrating the speed, but just to give you an idea. So you just got to use your imagination a little bit. Now, in this instance, there's too much air pressure that's built underneath. And so what happens is the vocal folds are very clever. They will try and compensate, and they will try and squeeze and hold back this airflow as much as possible. But what will happen, because they won't be able to control it, is they will likely burst apart quite violently and then slam back together again quite violently. There's going to be a lot of airflow, so a lot of friction, and ultimately this leads to dryness in the voice, losing your voice, and potentially more severe voice issues further down the track. What, as a speaker, you might be contributing to with this is perhaps you put too much force or strain or effort behind your voice. Maybe you feel like you have to really push your voice out when you're speaking. The chances are this is what's happening for you. There's just too much air pressure. Another thing I talk about all the time is your over breathing. So if there's too much air, the vocal folds won't be able to cope. So they will eventually come apart, but in quite a violent fashion. So it can be either or. It can just be that there's a lot of strain in the voice, or it could just be that there's a lot of air pressure because you've over breathed in the first place. And what you may also note, if this is you, if you think, yeah, I am someone that kind of strains a bit when I speak, you'll probably find your neck will get involved. So I see this a lot, particularly with men, actually, because there's more muscle in their voice. Larynx is bigger. There's usually a lot more sort of strain in the voice. So often the neck will get involved. and the neck gets involved to try and, again, assist the vocal folds coming together. So if you're seeing like the neck tensing, that's a very good sign that there's a lot of strain in your voice. So that's the first one. And I'm going to share some exercises in a minute of what you can do if you perceive this. And then the other one is too little muscle engagement. So remembering that the vocal folds, they are essentially a muscle at their core. There's many layers, but there's muscle at their core. And there's a weakness in these muscles. Could be a weakness for lots of reasons, as I spoke about before. Young girls have a lighter, weaker voice because the vocal muscles aren't fully developed yet. So that's just part of, growing up. But for an adult, there could be more severe issues going on. But a lot of the time, it's just because people don't give their voice any attention. They don't train it. They don't do anything with it. So you can actually build the strength in the voice. And so if there's not a lot of, if the muscles are weak and there's not a lot of power in those muscles, you're going to find a lot of air escapes. Your voice could be very breathy, could be very light, and it will be very, very difficult to get any power and strength in your voice. Because yes, it starts at this point, starts at the vocal fold level, and then gets amplified and modified in your throat, your mouth, and your nose. So let's now look at some things that you can do if you feel you're either at the strain sort of end of voice or at the lighter kind of breathy end of voice. Now, again, you're probably not going to be an absolute 10 out of 10. I mean, maybe you are, but chances are you might be like a 5 out of 10 or 8 out of 10. But just sort of think to yourself, where does my voice, on the two sides of the coin, which side of the coin does my voice generally go towards? The strained, pushed, squeezed side, or the kind of breathy, light, airy side? So first of all, let's just play, not literally, well, kind of literally, as much as we can do. Let's play around with the larynx for a minute. So I want you to put your hands on your throat and just speak and notice it bobbing up and down. Now, what you're touching there is thyroid cartilage, and specifically thyroid lamina. So this is actually sort of in a shield shape. So it's kind of like that, to protect the voice, to protect the vocal folds. And there's these two lamina, and and thyroid literally means shield in Latin. So it's kind of like this, obviously on a much, much tinier scale. So that's the first thing. That's that hard cartilage that you're feeling. And then you can just swallow and notice the larynx go down. And then yawn and notice the larynx rise. So let's just make sure that we've got that sort of very basic movement first of all. Now, then I spoke earlier about the Valsalva maneuver and how the larynx is amazing in helping us to like lift heavy objects and to do sort of heavy or grunt work, let's say. So I want you to pretend to pick something up that's really heavy. And notice, if you put your hand there, notice how the vocal folds will squeeze together and the larynx will move down. So this is just all about sort of familiarizing yourself with what happens within the larynx, because this stuff is happening all the time, but we don't give it any attention really. And then when you let go, there's like a little click, and that's the vocal folds coming apart again. So that's another lovely thing to try. The next one is if you keep your fingers on your throat and just make an S sound. Now you probably won't feel a whole lot going on there. Then change it to a Z, 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 an interchange between Z and S. Z, Z. And they are identical, S and Z, apart from one, the Z, the vocal folds vibrate, the S that they don't. So it's a really nice way to feel the vibration directly. And then you have that contrast with the S and the Z. And then finally, just a way to kind of open the voice up a little bit, open the vocal folds up, is a sniff and yawn. Sounds very bizarre. So it's like and you'll feel the sort of the throat opening. You'll feel, hopefully, the more kind of aware you are of the vocal folds kind of opening. And just a little point that I didn't mention before, because I didn't want to like bombard you with stuff, but the vocal folds we've been talking about are what we call the true vocal folds, but actually directly above them, we have what we call the false vocal folds. And they are really there primarily from a sort of nature's perspective to help seal the larynx. It's that sort of extra protection to protect the airway. But they often do get involved in speech when there's a lot of strain in the voice. So this action, this sniff and yawn, is just a way to kind of open everything up a little bit more. It's so funny. So now we've got a little bit more familiar with our larynx. Let's look at what we could do when we feel like there's a kind of heaviness or a strainedness in our voice. And then we'll also look at the kind of breathy, light option as well. So when you feel like there's a lot of strain in your voice, I mean, maybe just watch yourself, like notice, is my neck engaging when I speak? That's a very good sign that there's strain in the voice. Just notice, like, start to pay attention. Does the voice feel heavy? Does it feel pushed? Does it feel tight, essentially? So we spoke about onset before, and one really nice way of starting to kind of ease the strain in the voice is actually to practice using a silent H in words that you're speaking, because it just stops that grabbing and squeezing. And you can really put it in front of everything to start with, particularly vowels. And then eventually sort of you can just think it, and that will be enough. So if you were saying, hello, how are you? And you were practicing with this extreme H, it could be, hello, how are you? So you're literally putting that very extreme H in front of everything. And you'll notice there's a little bit more airflow. Hello, how are you? Play around with that and then see if you can then just think that H. So it's a silent H now. Now, obviously, this word, we do actually have H's. So just think very sort of gentle, a gentle kind of onset into them. Hello, how are you? Then you can try taking a sort of more normal sentence. I mean, anything you like, but let's take I'm going home. So again, we could put that sort of silent H in the front of that, but let's start first of all with the extreme version. I am going home. I am going home. I am going home. Because the tendency is, and we don't even know that we're doing it, when we fall into that sort of very strained, heavy version, we tend to just grab into everything. So this is an exercise in really stopping you from grabbing. Now, you do want to practice this as with everything voice related, and you're obviously not going to go around speaking like that. So practice this at home. And then it's really just about thinking that silent H, particularly at the start of any sentence, any new thought, any new paragraph. You're just thinking that silent H, and it just helps to take the pressure off the voice. And then hopefully it will function that little bit better. If the voice feels on the other end like it's very breathy and light, so there's a lot of air going through your voice. Hello, my name's Anuska, and I've got a lot of air in my voice. So what we want to do, first of all, is get a little bit of that vocal fold action, a little bit more of that closed vocal fold vibration happening. Because as I said earlier, when there's a lot of breathiness in the voice, there's just a lot of air. There's a lot of airflow. So a nice way to do this, first of all, is you're going to say bab, B-A-B, in a very staccato fashion. So if you don't know what that means, it's like very choppy. So bab, 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 bab. See if you can get that sort of, it's almost like you're bab, 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 bab. Make sure the lips stay soft though. Make sure you're not going bab, bab, because then you can see instantly my neck engaged. So keep the jaw, keep the lips soft. Bab, bab, bab. and then change it to barb, like Barbara, B-A-R-B. Barb, 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 barb. And feel that fullness. Feel, you can literally put your hands here, barb, and you'll feel a vibration. Feel the fullness in your mouth. Feel the sound in your mouth. Barb, 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 bab, bab, bab. But really important that you don't squeeze into the lips. Feel that resonance, feel that fullness, feel that chestiness. And then you can try a little bit more legato, a little bit smoother. Bab, 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 barb, barb, barb. So soften into the B versus bab, which is what we're doing at the beginning. It's almost like we're slightly stabbing just to kind of get the voice to do something completely different. And then see if you can carry that feeling, it's always a feeling, into shorter sentences. So if I was taking the sentence, Bob bought a new boat, let's just bring a little bit more of that chestiness, that fullness. Bob bought a new boat into that sentence. So we're really trying to train the voice now to not go to its pattern, which is Bob bought a new boat, but Bob bought a new boat. So we're just a little bit more intentional with those B's, with those vowels, and we're really finding that fuller, richer sound in our voice. So this was a very, very, very big topic, very complex, and I've tried to simplify it as much as I possibly could without sort of losing it completely. Very happy to answer any questions. If you have any specific questions, please do post them below. If this work interests you, if you think I need help with this, please do check out my website. You can book a voice discovery call and I can absolutely help you. It's very, very hard to do this by yourself because there's so much going on, as we've kind of looked at today. This is one aspect of voice. And you really want someone that kind of understands what they're hearing in your voice as well. So if you think you do need extra help, please do book a voice discovery call. I would love to help you. If not, feel free to post any questions below and I will do my best to respond to them. Sometimes it's tricky. Sometimes I would actually need to hear you to answer a question, but I will always try and do my best to respond. So thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed this and feel free to ask me questions and I'll see you on my next week's video. Thank you so much. Have a great day.